Welcome to the Teachers on Fire podcast, where 21st century educators come to share, learn, and be inspired. We believe in the growth mindset, creativity, communication, critical thinking, collaboration, and strategic uses of education technology. Our mission is to share news and views from teachers who are crushing it in the classroom and making a difference for learners everywhere. I'm your host, Tim Cavey. Let's jump into today's episode. Today I'm speaking with Joshua Stamper. Josh is an administrator, husband, father, blogger, artist, and the host of Aspire, the Leadership Development Podcast. You'll find his writing at joshstamper.blogspot.com. Josh, thanks so much for coming on the show today. Are you ready to talk education?
Oh, most definitely. Thank you for having me on the show.
My privilege, and loved your recent episodes on the Aspire podcast. I'm really enjoying following you on Twitter and so excited to jump into this. Why don't you tell us about your current education situation?
Sure. I've been an administrator for 5 years as an assistant principal, working on my 6th year, and I just moved districts and same role, but just a little bit closer to home. And absolutely loving the change.
Very cool. Well, as you've heard, if you've listened to previous episodes, I like to take guests to a low point in their career. So Josh, tell us about a difficult moment for you and then how you worked through that.
Yeah, definitely. So when I was a teacher and kind of deciding that I wanted to go into administration, I really took that to heart and went to my assistant principal and just asked for any opportunity I possibly could. And pretty soon they started to call me the office rat because I kind of was in the office at all times trying to just soak in as much information as I possibly could. And that was kind of a hard balance because I was not only teaching, but I was coaching and going to school. So there was a lot going on, but I was just very passionate about wanting to be in leadership. And so I spent a full year of getting that experience under my belt, had an opportunity to kind of sub in that administrative role. And every time I had an opportunity, I just fell in love with it even more. And so I went through the interview process and got through the first round with the principals. And then the second round was with kind of the higher ups in the administration. And a couple weeks later, I found out I didn't get in to the pool, which means, you're available to other principals to interview and potentially get an assistant principal job. And at the time I was like, well, I've experienced everything. I don't know what else I could possibly do to be ready for that role. And sometimes I go a million miles an hour. I see a goal and I do everything I possibly can to achieve that. But at the same time, I don't have the perspective of what it really means. I mean, I'm just so focused on the end goal that sometimes the journey gets lost. And so looking back, it was probably the best thing for me because although it was tough in the moment, I got to learn under a new principal the following year. And what he provided me during that year was a whole different perspective of the job and about administration. And although it was difficult to be rejected and to be told all these things I needed to work on, in the end, I think it made me a better administrator.
That's very cool. I love the silver lining sort of story. And it sounds like it turned out to be just exactly the path that you needed. So sometimes you learn that much more in a different context, right, Josh?
Yeah. I mean, I've had the opportunity to serve under 5 different administrators, principals, and each one is so different. And you definitely learn the job in a different viewpoint from each person.
So that's a nice segue into the Aspire podcast that you've started. And I believe you're now 14 episodes in. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. My last guest was Jeff Veal, and that just launched last Friday.
Talk to us about why you started the podcast. And obviously I have a personal interest in this as well. I've started a sort of a similar passion project. So what is your vision and where would you like this podcast focusing on leadership and education? Where would you like it to go?
Yeah, so the journey was really when I was administrator in my last district, I had an opportunity to kind of build a program for aspiring leaders and didn't really advertise it too much, but over about a week span, I had about 125 participants and it went really well. And I had a panel of administrators and they really talked about their roles and all the things that they did to get to where they were today. And I could just see all of the folks that were in attendance were just soaking up every word and they were like sponges and they just were longing for more information. They just kept asking like, are we going to do this again next year? And they wanted to kind of know the next steps. And I really just was kind of taking that to heart and trying to figure out, well, how can we help all these folks that want to aspire to be something else, to grow in their leadership skills? And so I kind of sat on that and just went to a couple of friends and hashed it out in conversation as to what path I could go in, and kind of landed on the podcast. And so that's really my goal, is just to bring really quality leaders to the table and just ask, their leadership journey, what their path was, what advice they have, what characteristics they feel like each leader should have. And then on top of that is just what's the joyful aspect of the job. Because I think a lot of times folks say things like, well, I can never really do that. I'm really happy that you're in this position because I just couldn't handle this student, or I really couldn't handle discipline. And usually it's a backwards compliment. It's they're giving you a compliment, but at the same time they're saying I can never do that, or I never would want to do that. And so after you hear that for so many years, it's like, well, I love my job and I'm making a great impact. And there's a lot of things that are wonderful about leadership. And I really just want to accentuate that within the podcast.
That is awesome. Now, you mentioned bring the joy back, or joyful leaders. Is that, you're probably familiar with Bethany Hill?
Yeah.
And her hashtag. Yeah. Do you follow her on Twitter? It sounds like you do.
Yeah, she was my second guest, and that's kind of the reason that I kind of go in that direction, is because I had an opportunity to co-write with her a blog post, and just got to know her and just kind of her beliefs, and we fall in line with a lot of things. And I just loved her vision in that too, of bringing excitement and joy back to leadership and bring it to the forefront, and trying to tell all the good things, the stories about schools that a lot of folks don't understand, that are going in behind the scenes. A lot of times education has a negative connotation, and so we want to just say, well, no, it's not how it was 20 years ago. There are things that are changing, and changing in a good way.
One of the things that I hear sometimes, or I think we all hear about Twitter in general, Josh, is that people call it a cesspool of negativity, and they talk about the trolls, and right now we see the pressure on Jack Dorsey to sort of tighten up some of the voices on Twitter. But I think the amazing thing in the education space on Twitter is it is such a positive space. And we have this community of educators, and I'm always encouraging more educators to join it, that is just incredibly positive and inspiring. And I don't know, maybe you might see the odd comment about teacher conditions or salaries, but in general, it is overwhelmingly positive and encouraging. So it's such a great place to be, and really appreciate the work that people like you and Bethany are doing there. So this sort of leads into my next question, Josh. What is it, thinking about education in general, what is it that excites you about education today?
Well, it's kind of like what I was just saying, as far as the rapid change that we've seen within even just the last decade. I think that people are finally understanding that there's other ways of learning and teaching, and that we don't have to just go with tradition. The way of saying, well, this is how we used to do it, or this is what I'm comfortable with. It seems to be that it's not about the teacher anymore; it's about the student and looking at their needs. And I'm really excited about like restorative practices, and looking at trauma-informed strategies, and looking at the child and their emotional needs, not just their educational needs, and trying to see that school can be so much more for a kiddo. It's not just about the educational piece and the learning, but then also about meeting all aspects of the child.
Moving on, Josh, we call ourselves lifelong learners, and that obviously applies to administrators too. We don't let our education leaders off the hook on that one. So outside of education, outside of the classroom, what's another area of passion and learning for you? What are you into, and what's lighting your fire these days?
Well, obviously my podcast is something I'm consistently learning about. We were talking about this before. Is just I love technology. I'm always trying to learn new aspects of technology, and that kind of coincides with the podcast. But then also, I used to be a graphic designer, so I kind of have a love of not only art but just the technical side of things. So I'm definitely kind of a tech geek in that sense. I'm trying to find new ways to learn new apps, or how to use different programs. So that's definitely what I'm consistently learning about. And then of course, just trying to get my hands on any type of leadership book. Reading right now, Culturized by Jimmy Casas, and trying to learn about how to positively impact a campus, and through working with culture. I think that's a really big piece with leadership on any campus.
I'm reading my way through that one as well, and so I'm going to add my vote to that one. We will talk books in a minute, but Going back to your graphic design past, Josh, that makes so much sense because if you are listening and you haven't taken a look at Josh's beautiful graphics, man, I've seen your stuff there on Twitter and thought, how in the world are you coming up with that? So I might come to you for some tips, but no, it looks beautiful, and keep up the great work. I think that's such good modeling just for the whole learning community, to come from an administrator and like you said, a lifelong learner. And for your teachers, for even your students, I don't know if any students find your podcast. That happened to me. So, you've got lots of learners in the community, I guess is my point, who can take a cue from what you're doing.
Well, I just want to note too, like as an art teacher, I think students, when I tell students that, they're always surprised because they think that, they put you in a box, like, oh, you're this type of teacher. And so I think that helps with the lifelong learner piece and modeling is, yes, I was an art teacher, and that's probably not what most administrators come from. But at the same point, when you learn and you grow, you can be anything that you want. And I think hopefully that's a model for other students about lifelong learning.
Yeah, love that. Josh, you're an administrator, which means you've got a ton of different duties, and constituents to connect with and communicate with at all times. So in terms of productivity and keeping all those plates spinning, tell us about a personal habit that contributes to your success.
Well, I think putting the things that are most important to the forefront. So, for instance, I like to be a present administrator and try and get as many classrooms as possible and be in the hallways and interacting with kids. So, if that's my number one goal, then I should be modeling that every single day. And so, the emails and the logistics and the documents that need to be done, I try and get to the campus early to work on those and then stay late. Which is obviously a hard balance when you have a family and kids. But at the same time, if my priority on campus is to make the greatest impact, that's with your presence and building those relationships. And you can't do that behind closed doors, and you can't do that behind a desk. So I think that's probably one of my passions and my personal habits.
Sounds like you've been reading Culturize.
Most definitely.
Let's move into our rapid fire recommendations. So I love to hear your picks in these different areas. Let's start at Twitter. I know you're active there and you've got a ton of followers already. So tell us about one education leader. This might be tough, but it's one person that maybe we should be following on Twitter and maybe it's someone that is sort of flies under the radar.
Probably Barbara Gruner. She's also a podcaster. She's got a podcast that she just put out. I think she's only on 4 episodes, but she's amazing. She's been posting some fantastic stuff. The show's called Character Speaks. It just came to me, and I would say that's one person that maybe is under the radar. But if you're looking for like a list of Twitter folks, I've got a list that's created the Aspire Edgy Leaders list, and there's probably about 100 people on there that I would highly recommend.
Okay, sounds good. And then next, Josh, you mentioned you're into technology. So point us to an edtech tool that you currently love using in your practice or your day-to-day work, something that lately has really been working for you.
Sure. Actually, I was just working with it today. It's Calendly. It links to Outlook. I use it for, in Texas, it's T-Test. It's the appraisal system for our teachers. But instead of having to correspond with each teacher and go back and forth via email, it just allows them to select a time and it auto-populates my calendar. And so if I put something in my calendar already, it doesn't show up on their end. So I just feel like it's a pretty efficient tool to schedule things like that when I have 20 to 30 people that I need to schedule in a short period of time.
That is very cool. I've heard that tool recommended on a non-education podcast, but I'm assuming you use that to schedule your podcast guests as well.
Sometimes, most often though, it's just through direct message. I've been very lucky with with calendars and making those things work.
Okay. And next, Josh, tell us about a book. Now, you've already mentioned Culturize. Maybe that's the one you want to stick with. Or is there one other that you've been reading this summer that you'd really like to recommend?
Yeah, the one I just finished before Culturize was Be Real by Tara Martin, and I would highly recommend it. She's amazing. I also had her on the podcast, and she just, everything that she puts in the book is her. I mean, she's just very transparent, and it's easy. She's a very likable person. Being real is definitely all about her, and what she has brought to education. So I would definitely recommend that book.
Okay, Be Real. And I don't have to ask you if you're a podcast listener. You told us about one earlier with, I think, Barbara Gruner, if I have that name correct. But is there another podcast that you'd say, yeah, that's one that we need to add to our daily commute this year?
No, I'm going to throw out two because I just like breaking rules. My Bad by Jon Harper, which hopefully everyone's listening to, kind of coincides with kind of what you're looking at too, is, finding a mistake and how we're reflecting upon that. And then ShareMO, which is Missouri Edu Podcast. I've been checking that one out lately too.
And then two more questions, Josh. The next one here is about YouTube. Now, people use YouTube in different ways, but if you are the type that actually subscribes to channels, is there one that you've found particularly useful or maybe just personally amusing?
Todd Nesloney's YouTube, I definitely check out all the time. Right now, he's doing the Tell Your Story series. He's been doing it through Facebook Live, but then posting it on YouTube. And just the guests that are on there aren't just all about education. There's various things that they talk about, trials that they've gone through in their own life. And so sometimes it's educational related, but a lot of times it's just about the trials and tribulations of their life. And I find that very interesting.
Well, I'll make sure to subscribe to that. And then finally, Josh, this question has nothing to do with education, or it might, but if you're at the end of your day, you've got no energy left, I'd love to hear, what are educators watching on Netflix, just purely for fun, or maybe for some laughs, or what is it?
Yeah, definitely for laughs. Honestly, right now, we are going. Me and my wife are going old school, and we are going through Frasier right now.
Wow, that is a throwback.
Yeah, and it is just as funny as when I was growing up. So, yeah, I love it.
Well, this has been awesome, Josh. Thank you so much for your time tonight and just your flexibility in putting this interview together. What are the best ways for the listeners to follow you? And let's make sure we highlight your Aspire podcast too.
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Joshua_Stamper, and also on Instagram at Joshua_Stamper, and you can find Aspire on SoundCloud or on iTunes.
All right, Josh. Well, have you started the school year there in Frisco, Texas?
Yeah, we have. We're in our second week. Actually, last week was nice. It was a 2-day week.
Yeah.
Highly recommend that. I was exhausted by the end of the 2 days, and it felt like a full week, but it was perfect. And we've had a fantastic start to the year.
Well, that's great to hear. This has been so informative and inspiring, and really love the message that you're sharing with the education community, Josh. So just want to wish you a wonderful year, and thanks again for your time. Have a good night.
Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Teachers on Fire, where teachers come to share, learn, and be inspired. Please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a review on iTunes, and follow us on Twitter at Teachers on Fire. I'm your host, Tim Cavey, saying goodbye for now, and we'll catch you next time, right here on the Teachers on Fire podcast.